Welcome to today's deep dive. We're tackling the biggest news stories impacting you today. February 3rd, 2025. We've got a whole stack of reports and analyses and breaking developments from California to Europe and beyond. And we're going to extract all the insights that you need to navigate this crazy news cycle. You ready?
Let's jump right in. It's fascinating to see how today's news kind of highlights the struggle between going with renewable energy sources and the allure of traditional fossil fuels.
Absolutely. The tension is definitely there. We've got California still grappling with those devastating wildfires.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are calling for faster implementation of ember-resistant zones around homes to try and lessen the damage in the future. The LA Times even suggested that these zones could have significantly lessened the impact of the recent fire.
This raises a crucial question, though, about whose responsibility this is. Like, is it on individual homeowners to take these precautions, or should the local and federal governments be playing a bigger role? It seems like individual actions might not be enough, especially when you consider the LA Times also reported that lawmakers are urging for federal action to monitor toxic pollutants released by these fires.
Oh, wow.
That's a public health concern that goes way beyond California.
You're right. The impact is much broader. In fact, it connects to another big story that's making headlines.
Yeah.
Europe's ongoing energy crisis. The New York Times is reporting that Europe is still feeling the effects of the energy crisis that was sparked by the Ukraine invasion 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And they've found new sources of energy, but the cost is causing a real economic strain.
It's a tough situation, and it really highlights the balance that governments have to find between securing energy and keeping the economy stable.
Right.
Some are pushing for a rapid transition to renewables, while others are holding on tight to fossil fuels.
Yeah. The Daily Climate has a number of articles about this very issue. From President Trump's renewed push for more drilling to Oatly, the oat milk company, exploring cleaner heat alternatives in their factories. It's really interesting to see how a company like Oatly is taking initiative, possibly signaling a shift in corporate thinking around energy. What do you make of that?
I think it shows that businesses are starting to recognize the potential of renewables, not just from an environmental standpoint, but also economically.
Yeah.
They're realizing that putting money into clean energy can actually be good for business, especially as technology gets better and costs come down.
Speaking of this kind of push and pull between old and new energy, the Trump administration seems to be making waves with some pretty controversial moves.
Oh, really?
The New York Times and the Daily Climate both reported on potential firings of over 1,000 EPA workers who focus on climate change.
This is a huge development. It raises concerns about the direction of environmental policy under this administration, especially when you consider the news about the removal of key public health data from the CDC website, which the Daily Climate said is raising a lot of eyebrows. About transparency?
It's definitely concerning. And it's not the only move causing a stir. The Daily Climate also reported that the Trump administration is halting approvals for offshore wind projects, despite the potential for clean energy and job creation.
This decision is interesting considering that at the same time, Duke Energy is pushing to weaken pollution rules for coal and greenhouse gases. This has environmental advocates worried about what it could mean for air quality and public health.
It's definitely a mixed bag of developments. And it's clear that the debate surrounding climate change and energy policy is far from over. We're seeing this real tug of war between different priorities, and it's playing out on a global stage.
It is. On one hand, you have climate activists protesting during Democratic Party meetings, demanding stronger action on climate change. And on the other, you have the U.S. Climate Alliance, backed by Michael Bloomberg, doubling down on the Paris Agreement goals as reported by the Daily Climate. It's a complex landscape.
It is.
With a lot of players and perspectives. And the science community is adding some important voices to this whole thing. Inside Climate News is reporting on a new study showing that glaciers in the Greenland ice sheet are falling apart faster than expected because of widening crevasses.
That's alarming. And the implications for rising sea levels are pretty significant, right?
Absolutely. And what's even more concerning is this isn't an isolated incident. We're seeing climate change play out in different ways all over the planet.
Like those deadly record-breaking floods in North Queensland, Australia that the conversation was talking about. It's a reminder that extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and intense. And the consequences are pretty far-reaching, impacting human lives, ecosystems, and even potentially spreading radioactive contamination. Like the Daily Climate pointed out in their article about wildfires in the Chernobyl exclusion zone.
It's definitely a sobering reminder of how interconnected all these issues are. But even with these challenges, there are some glimmers of hope out there.
Like those 5 cities that nearly ran dry because of drought,
Right.
but managed to turn things around by getting their water use under control.
Right.
It was highlighted in the conversation. It shows that proactive measures can make a real difference. What are some other positive developments we're seeing?
Well, there's been some interesting research coming out about potential solutions. For example, Skeptical Science highlighted a study about geothermal heat pumps gaining popularity as a way to reduce carbon emissions from heating and cooling.
That's great news.
Mm.
And it seems like individuals are also starting to look for ways to make a difference. Yale Climate Connections has a piece with tips on how to save gas money and reduce pollution.
It's encouraging to see people taking individual action even while we wait for those larger systemic changes.
Yeah.
And speaking of systemic change, there are some interesting developments on the political front as well.
You're referring to the climate activists in London protesting those long prison sentences that were given to the 16 just stop oil activists.
Right.
The Daily Climate covered that.
Hmm.
It seems like there's a growing tension between the people demanding urgent action and the authorities.
Yes, and it really highlights those tough questions surrounding civil disobedience and climate activism.
Yeah.
Where is the line between peaceful protest and disruption? It's a debate that will probably continue as the climate crisis gets more urgent.
Speaking of urgency, the Daily Climate also reported on how Puerto Rico is still struggling with frequent power outages, years after Hurricane Fiona devastated the island's infrastructure.
It's a stark reminder that for a lot of communities, climate change isn't some future threat. It's their reality. They're already facing the consequences, from extreme weather events to failing infrastructure.
And those consequences are only going to get worse.
Yeah.
Climate State has an alarming report about how the warming Arctic is now a net carbon source, releasing more carbon dioxide than it absorbs.
That's a major shift with potentially huge implications for global warming. It really emphasizes the need for urgent action to reduce emissions and stop things from getting worse.
And the potential consequences of inaction are pretty stark. Climate State also shared an article about a new study that suggests oceans could rise by as much as 6.2 feet by 2100.
Wow.
That's enough to submerge entire coastal cities.
It's a scary thought. But in the middle of all these warnings, there's also news that reminds us of how amazing and resilient our planet is. NASA's Earth Observatory has released some beautiful pictures of Searles Lake in California with all its colorful salt formations.
It's a nice reminder that even with all the challenges we face, there's still beauty to be found in the natural world.
And there are communities out there fighting to protect these natural wonders. Inside Climate News reported on how Wyoming tribes are pushing to control reservation water resources as the state tries to send it to outside irrigators. It highlights how complicated the issues surrounding water rights and resource management are in a changing climate.
It's clear that these issues are multifaceted, with economic and environmental and social implications.
For sure. And they need our attention and action.
It definitely feels like we're at a crossroads, facing all these really complex challenges, but at the same time, we're seeing some innovative solutions and communities coming together to protect what's important.
And it's not just about these big initiatives either. There are smaller grassroots efforts happening too, like the one that Inside Climate News talked about. A mitigation bank working to restore some threatened wetlands in New York. They're taking a site that was full of illegal dumping and turning it into this thriving habitat for birds.
Wow.
It's a reminder that positive change can happen at any level.
It's inspiring to see those kinds of success stories. But we should also acknowledge the places where progress is slower or facing some pushback.
Right.
Inside Climate News also had an article about Vermont potentially scaling back their climate ambitions, with their clean heat standard facing some serious opposition.
Yeah, it shows how hard it is to enact ambitious climate policies, even in places that have been leaders in this area. There are a lot of competing interests and concerns that you have to address, and it's hard to find solutions that make everyone happy.
Yeah, it seems like that tension is playing out at the national level as well. The Daily Climate reported that Democratic National Committee candidates are being challenged by climate activists who are demanding more aggressive action.
It's a sign that climate change is becoming a really big deal for voters, especially younger generations. They're demanding that their leaders take bold action to address this crisis.
And some leaders are stepping up. Climate Change Dispatch had an article about how governors in the U.S. Climate Alliance are holding strong on their commitment to to those Paris Agreement goals, even with the current administration's stance.
That's great to hear. It shows that action on climate change isn't just limited to the federal level.
Right.
States and regional groups are playing a big part in driving progress and showing real leadership.
It's encouraging to see all these different approaches to dealing with climate change.
Yeah.
From technological innovation to individual actions to policy changes at every level of government.
It's going to take this multifaceted approach to address such a complex challenge. And it's important to remember that we all have a role to play in this.
That's a great point. We can't just wait for others to take action. We all need to be informed and engaged and willing to do our part, whether that's making changes in our own lives or advocating for bigger changes in the system.
Exactly. Every action counts. And together, we can make a difference.
That was quite a deep dive into the news today.
Yeah.
We covered wildfires, melting glaciers, political debates, and some inspiring examples of climate action. What really stood out to you from today's news?
I think for me, it's the urgency of it all.
Yeah.
The science is clear. Climate change is happening right now, and it's impacting communities all over the world. We need to act quickly and together if we want to avoid the worst-case scenarios.
Absolutely. It's a huge challenge, but it's not impossible. We're seeing innovation and collaboration and a growing awareness of the need for change. And that gives me hope for the future.
Me too. We have the knowledge and the tools and the desire to create a more sustainable and just future. It's up to us to make it happen.
One thing that we didn't really talk about specifically today, but I think is worth thinking about, is the role of individual responsibility. With all these changes happening in energy policy and technology and global awareness, where do your choices and actions fit in? Are you more likely to think about getting an electric heat pump after hearing about Oatly? Food for thought. We'll see you tomorrow for another deep dive into the news that matters most.